about maybe your past, or maybe for some of you, your future. Most of you have been married at some point in time or another. So, for those of us, right, Carrie, you've been married before, right? No. For those of us who have been married, or who currently are, I want you to think about where. Where were you married at? Where was the ceremony conducted? For those of you who have not been married, where would you like to be married? Think about that for a moment. And I want you to take a moment, tell your neighbor. Tell your neighbor, where were you married at? Or where would you like to be if you're, say, Crystal, for example? So go ahead and take a moment, tell your neighbor. Where did you have your wedding at? Now, being that most of us have been married at one point in time or other, and those who have not have probably been to a wedding service at some point in time. I would assume pretty much all of us can be included in that statement. We have a general idea of what a wedding service looks like, right? At least the basics. The procession, the rings, the vows, and eventually the pronouncement. Right? I pronounce you man and wife, you may kiss the bride. Remembering the place where it all occurred, think about what kind of vows did you take? At your wedding, what kind of vows did you take? What did you pledge to do forever and for always? To have and to hold, to be faithful in sickness and health, to give yourself to your one and only. What's that?
Sounds pretty sad.
Oh. Wedding vows are all about faithfulness, aren't they? Faithfulness to our spouses. So how have we done, if we think back on those vows, how have we done in being faithful to our spouses? Have we fulfilled our vows? Or have we come up lacking? For some, we might think that is a very easy question. I have not cheated on them, so therefore, it's a yes. I have been faithful. But if we understand faithfulness to be a whole lot more than simply, I have not cheated on you, and we're still together, then our answer might be a little bit more difficult, won't it? Just like none of us can claim to be without sin, none of us can claim to have never been unfaithful to our spouses in some way or another. Remember, faithfulness is always, without fail, looking out for their interests and their needs first. Who has never messed that up? It means sacrificing without fail, never leaving them lacking, emotionally or physically. So can any of us say, we have done that without fail? Even Chris, I'm sure she's made mistakes here and there, right? Yeah. Remember last week when we talked about faithfulness? It was something that we give in spite of evil, not something we give because of perfection. We stick with one another through thick and thin. We overlook offenses and love in spite of weaknesses. And most importantly, we are consistently and constantly practicing the art of forgiveness. Because we are all broken and sinful people. A marriage to a person like us must always be flooded with forgiveness. While it might not be spoken specifically in our vows, we should understand that when we say we will be faithful always, that we are in fact saying, I will forgive you always, even without you having to ask. Forgiveness has to be one of the most, if not the most important element in every marriage, if that marriage is to succeed. Because every single marriage, without exception, is going to need some forgiveness here and there, isn't it? Right? None of us can say that there has not been a point in time where we have not had to forgive our spouses. In fact, we must understand that as we continue to discuss faithfulness, especially in the light of God's faithfulness, forgiveness might just be the single most important act connected to faithfulness. Think about it. What was God's single most defining act in all of Scripture? Jesus, right? And what is Jesus? The salvation of the world. In other words, the forgiveness of everything. So God being faithful to us is God being forgiving, displaying forgiveness towards us. The defining moment of what God calls being faithful is when He forgives. Let's read what for many of us is a very familiar story. Even if it's not a story we've heard before, although I think for most of us we have, we should understand that this in fact can be our story if we're only willing. So turn with me over to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. And if you were in Bible class this morning, you already know what we're going to read before you turn there. Luke chapter 15. Parable of the prodigal son. Ooh, this is a long one. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to the father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. We must understand that this parable is essentially about Jesus' audience, all of Israel, past, present, and future, and in reality, every single person in all of humanity. So, this is us here, right? Put yourself in the shoes of the younger brother. Put your brother, mother, neighbor, and friend here too. Because this story is about every single person in our lives. The only difference is that each of us might find ourselves in a different place in that story currently. So what has the son done here? What things has he turned his back on? Well, first and most obviously, his father, right? Understanding that, who is the father standing for in this parable? God, yes. Our Father in heaven. So, how has the son turned his back on his father? Well, first of all, the son, this request that the son is given is absolutely unheard of. You can just imagine the audience as Jesus hits that first line going, "Whoa! What? No way! No way!" They're probably thinking the very next step in the story is the father's going to pull out a big stick and he's going to say, "Here's your inheritance for you." You don't ask the father for his inheritance when he's still living. Remember, this is a culture dominated by family. How could you ask for something like that? He isn't dead yet. He's asking for his inheritance so that he might leave home. Now, obviously this is quite disrespectful, as no son would ever do this. And we're not saying this sarcastically. No son would ever do this. Give me what is mine. It isn't yours yet. And since it doesn't belong to the son, what he's taking isn't what's his, but rather he's taking what belongs to his father's, where it belongs to his father. This means his father is losing what was meant to provide for his family right here and now. On top of that, the father is losing much more than money, isn't he? In this society, it was the responsibility of the son to work for the father, because a family provides for each other. The father is also losing the labor needed to tend the fields. He will now either have to hire out, or he will have to harvest less. That also means that the older brother will probably be required to labor even more, even harder. And that comes into the story a little later, doesn't it? You also need to remember that there was no nursing homes during Jesus' time. Was this because there were no old people? No. There were plenty of elderly. But it was because the children were expected to take their parents into their home and care for them when they were older. Although we have to understand that taking them into their home, they really weren't taking them into their home because this was the family's home. They were taking them into their father's home to care for their father because they were in fact living in their father's home. Remember, family-dominated society. It's all about the family. So this younger son is taking away the security that the father had for when he grew old. He's essentially stealing his retirement account. But this isn't just a matter of abandoning family. This is a betrayal of the worst kind. This audience would probably feel me from the very beginning, thinking, you know what we do with those kind of people in Israel? We take them out back and we stone them. Harsh? Yes. But true nonetheless. The young son has clearly been made into the undeniable bad guy in this story. Surely we expect by the end of the story, this son is going to get what he deserves. But family is not the only thing that he's betrayed. The first thing the son does after he receives this inheritance is he gathers all his things and he runs off to a far country. He abandons his family, his people, and his country. This is not about patriotism here, though. This is about unity. He has divided, he has split, he has created another people, so to speak. He cannot live with them any longer. He tosses his history aside, abandoning everything that God has given him. After making many unwise and foolish choices, he finds himself without home, food, or money. He is entirely lost with nothing left to rely upon. But there is one last thing which he needs to abandon that he has not yet given up. In the parables, there are great symbolism. And the audience that Jesus is speaking to understands this symbolism. But for us, it might take a little bit more work. he is hired out to service pigs. Now, you would have found no pigs in Israel because they were considered unclean. It was against Jewish law to eat or to even tend pigs. To work with pigs is to abandon Judaism. In this moment, the son has now abandoned family, abandoned country, and abandoned his religion. He is no longer Jewish. He belongs to no one. He has no identity, and he has no purpose. This man is now thoroughly lost. He has nothing left to abandon, and no one left to betray. Now remember, who does the younger son stand for in all of this? All the world, and their need for their Father in heaven. You, me, and my neighbor, right? Maybe this doesn't sound that bad to you. Maybe it doesn't sound like he's done that terrible of a thing. But remember to take all the other stories into account about God, about the so-called people of God. And remember that this is who Jesus is talking about here as well. Isaiah 65, verse 5. Remember we read it a few weeks back? That verse where Israel looked at God and they said to him, "Keep to yourself, do not come near to me, for I am too holy for you." These are the same people. Or how about Isaiah 58:3, where the people go out and oppress one another, where they oppress anyone they view as smaller than themselves. And then they try to distract everyone from their wrongdoing by covering it up with churchy things. In one hand is the Bible, and in the other hand is the rod of the oppressor. These are the people Jesus is referring to as being the younger son. So, what is God's response? What is the Father's response when the Son does return? Having nothing left to abandon, being nobody of himself, what does God do? Remember that God is faithful to all of us no matter what. So in this moment, how does God show himself to be faithful? When we are caught red-handed, coming home, what does it mean for God to be faithful? Well, in the story, without even a second thought or even consideration, you'd think there'd be some kind of buildup, but there's nothing. There is just the Father racing out, forgiving and rejoicing. He throws a great party, the kind of party that you see but maybe once a year, because he got his son back. God will forgive even the most egregious error, transgression, if we'd only return to him. This is what it means for God to be faithful. But what does that have to do with our faithfulness? Well, does the parable end with God forgiving the younger son? Or is there a little more to it? Well, look back there. Jesus isn't done, is he? Verse 25. Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound." But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your commands. Yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." What does this have to do with our faithfulness? Well, if God being faithful means that God forgives, then our being faithful to God means that we forgive as well. This isn't just a matter of forgiving each other either. If we are to be faithful to God, then we must forgive others. To refuse forgiveness is to refuse faithfulness. We must realize that there are more than two people involved in this act of forgiveness. There is you, me, and God. I'm not called to forgive you because you're somehow good or because you're somehow deserving this. Spouses, hear this as we're thinking about our husbands and wives, right? We are not called to forgive them or be faithful to them because they are somehow good or deserving of it. I'm not called to forgive you because I am trying to be faithful to you, even though I should act faithful towards you, right? But I am called and must forgive you because I have been forgiven. I must forgive you because God is faithful. Because that's what it means for me to be faithful to Him. Do we realize that when we choose not to forgive, God has already forgiven? Which means we're refusing God's choices here. We're refusing God's plan here. And we begin to look a lot like Saul trying to kill David because God anointed David to be the next king. It's pretty senseless. We're not fighting against David any longer, we're fighting against God. In this parable, the father didn't just lose one son. He lost the younger one, but he returned and was forgiven and redeemed. But when his lost son was found, his older son was lost because of his refusal to receive his brother. And then the story just ends. Wouldn't you like to see it? Okay, and then the father brings us to some conclusion where he says, okay, now come back in, and the older son eventually comes back in and celebrates together. Right? But instead, we're just left with this older son lost. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to the older son? Will he come back? Will he go away? Will he be angry? Will he forgive his brother? No answer. Because it's up to us. We are all really the lost son in some form or another. But sometimes we're the lost older son. And sometimes we're the lost younger son. The only difference is one doesn't realize they're lost. Will we overcome ourselves in order to be found? Realize as well as we continue to talk about marriage. There are three people in a marriage. One might be lost, but not necessarily for good. Being the son or daughter that is going to display acts of unfaithfulness, since we can't get around it, that might be us. If we wish to see any relationship succeed, including a marriage, we must be willing to return, meaning realize and accept that I am lost, I have screwed up, and I do need to come back and say, sorry, that was me, my fault. But we must also be willing to give forgiveness to the one who is returning. You know the hardest part about returning after you screwed up? Wondering if you're going to be forgiven, isn't it? What if that relationship, that marriage relationship, is built on a forgiveness where you don't have to be over here while I'm over here, this uncomfortable gap between us because somebody screwed up and nobody wants to acknowledge it. But we feel comfortable enough to be able to come back together and say, hey, I screwed up, because we know that exactly what our marriages are built upon. Because that's what we have in God, isn't it? Any relationship that does not have forgiveness is unfaithful to not just one person, but two people. First, we're unfaithful to the person who's committed the wrong. They have screwed up and they have done wrong, but we are committing a wrong in response. And we are unfaithful to the person who has returned. But there's a second person, right? God. When we claim to live in the forgiveness of our Father, but we refuse to practice that same forgiveness to others around us, especially to our spouses, we are unfaithful to God. And if we're unfaithful to God, we are very close to becoming the one ourselves who is truly lost. God will always receive a repentant person, whether you're willing to receive them or not. Your forgiveness has no bearing on whether the lost are found. But your choice to forgive or not has a great bearing on you. Forgiveness is foundational to faithfulness. If we wish to be faithful to our God, then we must forgive everyone, everything. There is no such thing as an unforgivable offense. We'll wrap up with Matthew chapter 6, verse 14 and 15. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses.